You know, we are in a very interesting place right now in the gaming industry where the graphics on these games, I don't want to say they're peak, but compared to the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, it's way different now than it was back then, right? And for that reason, I want to talk today about realistic graphics versus stylized or art style graphics, right? The reason for this topic is because what I've seen between, these different consoles, different companies and stuff like that, they all have their own thing, right? And it's questioning whether what is the best in terms of graphics, right? Or what do people prefer? What makes one better than the other, or are they the same? What's the difference, right? So this is why I wanted to talk about this. Let's start off with realistic art style, realistic graphics, right? So games like, Horizon Forbidden West, the new Hellblade 2 looks incredible, right? Then you have The Last of Us Part 1, Spider-Man 2, these kinds of graphics that really push that realism in a game is really incredible, where to the point that, for example, my parents came the other day and I was playing Spider-Man 2 and they thought it was a movie. We're at that point where these realistic graphics are becoming more cinematic, more, realistic, and I'm not sure how much more can we push in terms of realistic graphics, and it's just crazy to see when you play these games like God of War, Horizon, Dead Space, all these heavy graphic games that when they do a cutscene, right, and then it just moves to the gameplay and there's no difference whatsoever. We're at that point, right? Now, obviously they could push more into that, but it's just crazy to see that now we're at that point where sometimes in certain games you can't even tell the difference, right? Which is really crazy. Now, what I really like about realistic, graphics is the same reason, right? That most people love, which is give you that cinematic experience, right? That make you feel immersed into something that could happen or how something could look in real life in a game and stuff like that, right? So for me, that's what really captivates me in these kinds of games, right? And it comes to the point where sometimes I don't even feel that in a movie, like I know games are different than movies and shows, right? But the way that, for example, The Last of Us, how that captivated me in the game, obviously the show did as well, but the first time I played Last of Us, now seeing it how it looks right now, it really shows and it really makes you feel right for these characters and stuff like that. Same with Horizon or Dead Space or Hellblade. Like, these games are incredible for that, right? It makes you emotional or just stuff like that where you feel that same way in a movie, right? That's why the movies are really popular in the mass of just people, right? They prefer, or more people like watching movies and playing games. Obviously the video games are far more bigger, right? But it just comes to that point where people that don't even play video games, right, they can't even tell if it's a movie. And maybe those people that don't really play video games, they're more interested in these kinds of realistic games because of the same reason, right? It looks like a movie, oh, the cutscene and this and that, right? So it's just incredible to just think about that, where we're at this point where can they really do more with realistic graphics, And I'm really wondering that, especially for the next generation of consoles, because I know, Xbox and PlayStation focus more on that style of, cinematic, and it's becoming to the point where the game's budget is just dramatically high, that to the point that these games are taking way long to make and these companies are barely making any profit. But now moving on to the other side of graphics in video games, we have stylized art style graphics. This could be like cel shaded, anime, fantasy, anything that's more crazy that you can't really do with realistic and less realistic, graphics, right? So this is, if I had to choose between both, this is my favorite kind of graphics in video games, the stylized art style. And the reason for this is a couple of reasons, because one thing that I like, obviously what I really like is JRPGs, right? And almost all these JRPGs, except for some exceptions, there's some exceptions that do use more realistic graphics, right? But for the most part, they are created with this kind of style, stylized art style, right? And what I believe in these kind of games is that this kind of graphics, the art can be timeless, So we see games from the past, classic games like Chrono Trigger, for example, right? That game could be played in today's day, even though the graphics or especially realistic graphics are way too realistic. That game itself, how it looks, can be played in today's day and it wouldn't feel, far apart from what we have now. Even in today's day, we have games that look like they were from back in the day. Like, for example, you have Octopath Traveler, right, where they used 2D HD art style. Obviously it's not realistic, but this is what I'm talking about, where these graphics could be timeless in terms of they could be used in any generation. Just like I said, an example with Octopath Traveler, right? The sprite or 8-bit style, 16-bit style graphics, that has been done before, but now you just innovate from that itself, We've seen Mario Wonder, for example, a unique 2D Mario game that has really crazy visuals and art style, right? People love that game because of that reason. It looks so clean, even though it's not realistic. We've had so many games from the past that use this realistic graphics, and in today's day, when you go back and play those games, they don't really keep up with the times, right? They look really crusty or sometimes even unplayable, right, because of the visuals or the faces of the characters and stuff like that. But like I mentioned, with this kind of art style, you can truly play any game in any generation. The only thing I would say is that some mechanics will be outdated, but in terms of the visuals and stuff like that, it basically becomes timeless. You've seen Mega Man games, you've seen all these kinds of games, Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, a classic. These games look great even in today's day, and especially if they do remaster that kind of style, it just looks 10 times better, like the original, but better, right? More modern. For me, the reason that I really love this kind of graphics is that, at least in my opinion, you could do more, right? You could create something incredible that you can't create in realistic graphics or realism or whatever, right? We've seen Xenoblade Chronicles, for example, Definitive Edition. That world itself blew my mind the first time that I played that game. I've never seen a world created that way, with Titans in that form, that it blew my mind. Sure, maybe you can create something in realistic graphics, but not to that extent. I feel like with this kind of art style, the stylized art style, you can basically have anything you want, right? As long as you have that imagination, you could create it, right, in video games. And not only that, but for example, in anime, the reason that I love anime, not only storytelling, right, but in certain fights. I mean, everyone who's seen anime knows those iconic fights, either Naruto, Dragon Ball Z, stuff like that, right? These kind of fights or in games, right? These cutscenes or stuff like that, right? It can only be done in this kind of style. So this is why I prefer this style more. They both have their unique, things and graphics that you could create. You have on one side the realistic graphics where you could be more attached to that, feel more emotional because, obviously sometimes they even use reactors. So sometimes it feels more emotional with these realistic graphics. And then on the other side, I'm not saying that that's the only way you could feel emotional, but on the other side, these anime comic book style, cel shaded style graphics are just beautiful to look at in any timeline. That's what I mean, right? Another thing that this stylized art style graphics could do or has done is that it takes less time to create a game using art style alone compared to realistic graphics, right? So we've seen many games come out from these companies, from consoles, from first-party games, whatever the case, right? And it feels like these hyper-realistic graphic games are taking longer, like I mentioned earlier, more than this other kinds of games, right? So I feel like the art style games, the art style graphics just take way less to make, and you can create whatever you want, right? And multiple games using that kind of art style, less resources you could use, less money to invest, and create more of that product. So obviously they all have their ups and downs. People do prefer what they prefer. Some people prefer more realistic, other people prefer just art style and gameplay more than anything, right? But I'm just curious what else they can innovate from what we're at right now, because we're in a really interesting place in gaming where everything that has been done from the past, everyone learned, right? The art style, the realism, different mechanics, different tools that they use, right? I feel for the most part everything has been done, and I don't think there will be another wow moment in gaming industry where we had like in the 64 era, right, where they went 3D and we saw 3D Mario for the first time, or PS1 when they used CDs instead of cartridges. Like those moments that were just phenomenal and like classic moments that you could never experience again. I wonder if we will feel or see something like that ever again, you know, which makes that really interesting. But y'all let me know in the comments below, what do you prefer, more realistic, hyper realistic graphics, or the more stylized art style graphics? And with that being said, be sure to share, subscribe, and like the video, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.